June 25, 1876. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, better known as Custer's Last Stand, ended in total disaster. General George Armstrong Custer and more than 200 men of the 7th Cavalry were wiped out by Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. But what if I told you the story you've been taught, the clean, heroic version, was a carefully crafted lie? The U.S. Army didn't just lose a battle that day. They covered up what really happened to Custer and his men. The truth was so disturbing, so humiliating, that it was hidden for decades from the American public, and even from Custer's own widow. In this video, we'll uncover the shocking eyewitness accounts, the mutilations the Army refused to admit, and the dark secrets buried on Last Stand Hill. By the end, you'll see exactly why the Army lied, and how the truth changes everything you thought you knew about Custer's last stand. But before we continue, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video. For the victorious warriors, the first order of business was looting. The fallen soldiers had valuable goods, guns, ammunition, jewelry, uniforms, even their horses. Now these spoils belonged to the victors, just as they knew the Americans would have done if the battle had ended differently. Lakota warrior Brave Bear later recalled the chaos, warriors boasting over their finds. "I got some tobacco, I got coffee, I got a good gun." To them, the loot was a rightful reward for victory. But the process showed no mercy to the dead. Nearly every soldier's body was stripped bare and left to decay in the summer sun. Scalping was a traditional practice, and soon the hills were filled with the grim sight of warriors cutting trophies from their fallen enemies. This wasn't limited to men. Native women also took part in the desecration. 2 Cheyenne women later admitted to driving awls into Custer's ears, a symbolic punishment for refusing to listen to warnings. Years afterward, it emerged that someone had also shoved an arrow into Custer's body in a place too indecent to describe, a detail hushed up by the Army to spare his widow further pain. Lakota warrior Ironhawk recalled seeing soldiers who had feigned death only to be discovered by women. He told of one soldier, stripped naked and about to be mutilated, suddenly leaping up to fight for his life. The women quickly killed him, but Ironhawk remembered the scene as darkly comical, a naked man fighting off 2 elderly women. Not everyone found it amusing. According to legend, even Sitting Bull himself was disturbed by the spectacle. According to later accounts, Sitting Bull claimed his visions had promised a great victory, but also carried a warning. If his people disturbed the dead, they would invite a curse. Whether he truly opposed the mutilations remains uncertain. By the time interviews were recorded, years after his own downfall, Sitting Bull may have been distancing himself from actions that outsiders condemned as barbaric. But the fight didn't end with Custer's death. The bulk of the 7th Cavalry was still alive, entrenched under Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen atop Reno Hill. Sitting Bull's warriors launched relentless assaults through the night of June 25th and throughout the 26th. Only at dawn on the 27th did they withdraw, after scouts spotted columns of American reinforcements approaching. Reno and Benteen, exhausted and bloodied, had no idea what had happened to Custer. The grim discovery fell instead to General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon as their reinforcements advanced into the area. Scouts first stumbled upon looted officer uniforms tossed aside in abandoned camps. Before Terry and Gibbon could process what this meant, another scout arrived with chilling news. "I have counted 197 dead bodies lying in the hills." "White men?" they asked immediately. "Yes, white men," the scout confirmed. The commanders now feared the unthinkable, that Custer and his entire command had been annihilated. Relief came only when they located Reno and Benteen's battered survivors still clinging to Reno Hill. The 2 officers, shocked to learn of Custer's fate, had believed he had ridden off in search of glory, leaving them to die. Soon after, Benteen and a detachment were ordered to track down Custer's column. What they encountered was beyond imagination. After 2 sweltering days under the Montana sun, the corpses were already decomposing. The first cluster of bodies they found belonged to L Company, commanded by Custer's own brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun. They still lay in the same defensive formation they had assumed in their final desperate moments on Calhoun Hill. Elsewhere, there was no order, bodies scattered as though struck down in panic or perhaps moved by the victors afterward. Another concentration of corpses lay on what would be forever known as Last Stand Hill. It was here that Private Jacob Adams made the most devastating discovery. He stumbled upon the body of the 7th's commanding officer. Calling for Captain Benteen, he watched as Benteen rushed forward, gazed down, and confirmed the unthinkable. Custer himself was among the dead. "By God," Captain Benteen muttered, "that's him." George Armstrong Custer's body was found near the crest of Last Stand Hill, barely 20 feet from his brother Tom. Like most of his men, he had been stripped of everything but his socks. Unlike Tom, however, Custer's scalp remained intact. His body rested in a sitting position, propped against 2 other fallen soldiers. Lieutenant James Bradley later remarked that Custer's face wore an almost peaceful look, as though he had simply fallen asleep. The rest of his command was not so fortunate. Nearly 200 bodies from Custer's battalion lay scattered between the bluffs and the riverbank near Sitting Bull's abandoned camp. In a public letter, Lieutenant Bradley reassured readers that the remains showed little sign of mistreatment, insisting that most wounds came only from the finishing off of the wounded. But Bradley was not telling the truth. Private Charles Windolph, who walked the battlefield that day, admitted later that Bradley was sparing the families back home. "They were badly mutilated," Windolph confessed, "some of them too bad to talk about." The horror was undeniable. Many of the dead had been scalped. Some were pierced with arrows even after death, others battered by war clubs and hatchets. One of the most gruesome sights was that of Isaiah Dorman, a black interpreter. His mutilated body was left beside a kettle, grotesquely filled with his own blood. The entire landscape was a scene of cruelty. Even Custer himself had not escaped abuse. Official reports only recorded 2 gunshot wounds, one to his chest beneath the heart, the other to his left temple. Either could have killed him. There was also a knife wound to his thigh. But what was not reported, deliberately kept secret, was that an arrow had been shoved into his body in a place too degrading to describe. That detail was buried to shield his widow from unbearable grief. Tom Custer's fate was even worse. He had been scalped, his skull smashed, and his body cut open. Only a tattoo on his arm allowed anyone to identify him. 2 hot summer days had passed since the battle. By the time reinforcements reached the field, decomposition was well underway. Colonel Gibbon admitted the stench alone was unbearable, the corpses already offensive when he arrived. For the survivors who saw it, the memory of that sight and smell would never leave them. It has long been believed that no one survived the massacre on Last Stand Hill. But Private Jacob Adams, the first man to identify Custer's corpse, recalled making another discovery that challenged that assumption. As Adams and others moved among the bodies, they suddenly heard a sound. A faint, distressed cry came from the carnage. It was not a soldier calling for help. It was a horse. The lone survivor of Custer's command, a battle-scarred bay gelding named Comanche. The horse belonged to one of Custer's fallen officers whose body lay nearby. Riddled with 7 wounds from bullets and arrows, dehydrated and weak, Comanche had refused to leave his master's side. When Adams and the soldiers spotted him, they rushed to help. No man served in the cavalry without respecting its horses. Against the odds, Comanche was able to stand. He was led away to rejoin what remained of the 7th Cavalry. Other horses were recovered from the battlefield, but none captured the imagination like Comanche. His injuries, his loyalty, and his solitary presence on Last Stand Hill gave him a special place in history. He would recover, live out a long retirement as the regiment's mascot, and when he died in 1891, Comanche became one of only 4 horses ever honored with a full military funeral. The following day, June 27th, was spent counting and identifying the dead. The task was grim and often uncertain. Many bodies were too disfigured to recognize, and in some cases, identities were little more than guesses. 19 men were never accounted for at all. In the years that followed, human remains were still being discovered in the surrounding hills, raising the haunting possibility that some men had escaped the initial slaughter only to be hunted down later. On the morning of June 28th, the burials began. Benteen recorded 208 bodies laid to rest, while Bradley wrote down 206. The exact number hardly mattered. It was a rushed, desperate job. With the threat of renewed attacks from Sitting Bull or his allies, the soldiers had no time to dig proper graves. Most were placed in shallow pits where they fell or interred together in hastily dug mass graves. Custer and his brother Tom were buried side by side at the foot of the hill. Their resting place was barely 2 feet deep, their bodies wrapped in canvas, covered with stones and a crude wooden sled in a futile attempt to keep scavengers away. Different accounts disagree on who actually performed the burial. Several men later claimed the honor. By 6:30 p.m., the grim duty was finished. General Terry wasted no time. That same evening, he ordered the column to march back toward the main Bighorn River. 50 wounded men still required urgent care, and word of the disaster had to be carried to the outside world. The trek back to the steamer Far West was long and brutal. Medics tended to the injured as best they could. One man even lost a leg along the way. Despite their efforts, several more succumbed to their wounds before reaching safety. For those who survived, the scars of Little Bighorn ran deep. Major Marcus Reno, once one of the regiment's senior officers, drowned his memories in alcohol. In the 22 days following his return, he purchased 11 gallons of whiskey, trying and failing to drink away the horror of what he had lived through. Captain Benteen, like Reno, turned to alcohol in the aftermath. His drinking soon led to a violent quarrel with Captain Thomas Weir, who openly accused him of abandoning Custer on the battlefield. Benteen, furious, demanded satisfaction and challenged Weir to a duel. Weir declined, but the guilt consumed him all the same. By December 1876, Weir was found dead in a New York hotel room, another casualty of Little Bighorn. Meanwhile, the steamer Far West raced up the Missouri River carrying 38 wounded men and the dreadful news of Custer's defeat. It set a record pace, completing the 710-mile journey back to Fort Abraham Lincoln in under 3 days. Before dawn on July 6th, the sound of the ship's whistle stirred Libby Custer from sleep. At 7 a.m., a group of senior officers knocked on her door. Her sister-in-law Maggie, wife of Lieutenant James Calhoun, was also awake, anxious for word of her husband and brothers. The officers ushered the women into the parlor, and there delivered the devastating news. Libby had been George's sweetheart since their teenage years. After 12 years of marriage, their love letters still glowed with affection and devotion. Now her world collapsed. One officer, Lieutenant Gurley, later admitted it was one of the hardest moments of his life. Imagine the grief of those stricken women, their sobs, their flood of tears that knew no consolation, yet Libby showed remarkable resolve. Rather than withdraw into private mourning, she insisted on joining the officers as they broke the same news to the other 26 women at the fort who were now widows. Her life from that day forward was forever defined by Little Bighorn. Until her death in 1933, Libby defended her husband's honor, blaming Reno and Benteen for the disaster while fiercely preserving Custer's reputation. The wider world learned the truth the next morning. On July 7th, the news reached Washington by telegraph. Only days earlier, the nation had celebrated its centennial with pride. Now the mood shifted to shock and mourning. Custer's annihilation dominated the headlines, sparking bitter debates over who bore responsibility. Was it Custer's reckless ambition? Reno and Benteen's failures? Whatever the verdict, one fact was undeniable. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was one of the worst defeats the U.S. Army had ever suffered at the hands of Native American warriors. And its legacy would haunt the nation for generations.